Thanks very much, Robin. I got an email from Robin this morning. I've been preparing all night a 25-minute talk, and I got an email from Robin this morning saying, "Should we do 15 minutes each?" So I've taken out all my jokes, and I'm leaving all the jokes and the fun slides to Robin and to Marta. Um, what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about the EUGI program. And overall, this is a huge program that's been conducted over across Europe over the past 5 years or so, and it has various components to it. And its overall aim is to try to understand the interplay between environmental, clinical, and genetic factors in the onset, severity, and outcome of psychotic disorders. And you'll get some sense of the scope and ambition of this then when I say that what I'm going to talk about is one component of this program. And the component that I want to talk about is the incidence and case control work that we've been doing in 5 European countries and also in a 6th country. And specifically what I want to do is to give you a flavor of the findings that are beginning to emerge from that and give you a sense of the data. But hopefully, as you'll appreciate, a study of this size and magnitude, generating the data is a challenge. Cleaning and then getting the data into a form where it's analyzable is a whole other challenge as well. So I'll present some indicative data and findings from that. So what I want to do, if I can get this to work, where do I point the thing? Well, I can tell you what I'm going to do while I try and get the slides to move. Is I'm first of all going to talk about 3 observations that I think underpin this work, that many of you may be aware of, but it's worth restating them. Then I want to say a little bit about the aims of this part of the EUGI project, explain a little bit about the method, and then go on to talk about some of the indicative findings. And if possible, and if there's time, say a little bit about the next steps of where these analyses are likely to go. So the first observation, and again, many of you are going to be aware of this already, is that we now know that the incidence of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders varies really quite markedly across populations. About 12 years ago, John McGrath published a meta-analysis showing that incidence varied by about 5 times across different studies. There's been lots of work showing, as this slide shows, that there's a higher incidence amongst migrant and minority ethnic populations, amongst some migrant and minority ethnic populations, and also that there's a higher incidence in urban areas compared with rural areas. But one thing that's lacking from this literature is that there hasn't been, since the WHO studies in the 1970s and 1980s, a single study that's looked simultaneously using directly comparable methodology, incidence in different countries. So we don't know, for example, whether the variation that we see is partly methodological, but we also don't know whether there are any patterns by different geographical areas other than within countries. The second observation is that in parallel with this emerging literature showing that there's variations in incidence, we now know that there's a whole range of social risk factors that are associated with the development of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. And this slide is just listing a few of them. Researchers tended to look at factors that operate at both neighborhood levels, as you can see here, and at individual levels, both in childhood and in adulthood. One of the issues here is that what's happened is that there's been an emergence of lots of studies looking at each of these factors in isolation in relation to psychotic disorder. Most of the work that has been done, or not most, but a lot of the work and where a lot of the attention is focused is on childhood and childhood adversity. And there are various talks and symposiums in this conference looking at this. And this slide shows findings from a recent meta-analysis around about 30 plus studies of childhood adversity. And what it found was that irrespective of study design, there's an association with later development of psychosis, be it psychotic experiences in general population samples or psychotic disorder, and that the effect is roughly the same for each of these. But there remain a number of questions about this. So one issue, for example, in looking at social risk factors is that the distribution and prevalence of these different factors varies across populations. But the meaning also of these kinds of experiences varies across populations. If any of you in the previous symposium, Peter Jones talked a lot about our need to become much more focused on meaning and how these kinds of experiences are interpreted and are internalized subjectively. But we've not yet done studies, we don't have data which directly compares across different populations prevalence and the impact of these types of experiences. We also don't know much about the timing of exposure. We don't know much about the different types of experience. We don't know anything about the severity and whether that relates to onset and so on. But one thing that we do know, and that is clear from this, is that none of these risk factors are in and of themselves sufficient or necessary for the onset of a psychotic disorder. And this, in fact, is true, pretty much true for every risk factor that we know of in psychosis. And of course, what that means is that there must be causal partners for each of the risk factors, that each individual risk factor must be combining with other risk factors to increase risk, so that these factors must operate together to explain why it is that some people develop disorder and others don't. And possible candidates include interactions with genotype, but also interactions with other environmental factors. And these three observations, variations across populations, increased interest in social risk factors, and an acknowledgement that there must be interactions between risk factors, begins to point to a need for studies which covers different populations, but also are sizable enough that they can explore and examine these types of interactions and the co-participation of different risk factors in the onset of psychotic disorder. And that's essentially what the EU-GI project was set up to investigate. And what I'm going to talk about, as I mentioned, is the incidence and case control component of that study. Essentially had three aims. The first aim being to estimate and compare incidence rates across different populations across Europe. Second, to then from that estimate and compare the effects and impact of different risk factors, particularly environmental risk factors across populations in Europe. And finally then to move on from that to examine the co-participation, the combined effect of different risk factors, genes, environments, and also different types of environments. And this was a study that was done in 6 countries, in the UK, sites in the UK, in the Netherlands, in France, Italy, Spain, and also in Brazil. And of course you'll notice that Brazil isn't a European country. Sadly, neither will the UK be a European country soon, if we do come out. And in each of these areas, we identified defined catchment areas where we sought to identify all individuals with a first onset psychotic disorder from which we could estimate incidence over a range of between 1 year and 4 years, giving us a total of over 12 million person years at risk, making this effectively the largest study of its kind ever conducted. Our aim in this was to identify all new cases and from that to assess at least 1,000 cases in detail, and I'll say a little bit more about that, and a comparable population-based comparison group in each of these centres. Our criteria for inclusion were very broad, simply first presentation, any psychotic disorder aged between 18 and 64. And for the controls, we used a combination in different sites of quota and random sampling, essentially to get a sample which was representative of the population from which cases came. And again, aged between 18 and 64. And from cases and controls that we identified, we collected a whole range of information across a range of different risk factors, clinical, social, and cognitive. And we also collected DNA for genetic analyses. What I'm going to talk a little bit about is some initial data in relation to childhood adversity, and that comes from these 2 questionnaires, a childhood trauma questionnaire and the childhood experiences of care and abuse questionnaire. So what did we actually find? So I'm going to show some site-specific data, but just overall in this project, over the course of about 4 years in the different sites, we identified in total around about 2,500 new incident cases of psychosis. Of those, we managed to collect this detailed information from in excess of 1,100, meeting the target that we'd originally set, and many more controls were we able to also identify and assess, around about 1,500 cases and controls, forming the basis for case control comparisons. So we're able to do 2 things. We can look at incidence rates and compare across different populations. We can look at risk factors and compare across populations, and then we can use that to be able to look in more detail, because of the sample size, at some of the more fine-grained aspects of risk. So to begin by showing some data on incidence rates, and this is data that's been analysed primarily by Hannah Youngsma at the University of Cambridge, supervised by James Kirkbride, now at UCL, and Peter Jones. And what I'm going to show is some data from select sites. So I'm not going to show all of the sites, but I'm going to show you select sites, and really the patterns that I show you relate to are true across the board. So firstly, overall, we found that if you combine everything together, we have an incidence rate of all psychotic disorders of around 20 per 100,000 person years at risk. Usually, the literature suggests that for all psychotic disorders, the incidence is around about 30 per 100,000, so this is somewhat lower than we might expect. We then use that as a baseline and compare rates in different sites with that and look at whether or not there's evidence of variation. And there are two things to note from what we're finding. The first is that there is evidence of quite wide variation, up to a 10-fold variation across the different sites, although it's not shown entirely on this slide. So confirming that there is strong evidence of variation in incidence rates across environments and across populations. The second thing to note is that in line with previous studies, we find that the highest rates are in Northern European cities. So for example, shown here, London, which has age and sex and ethnicity adjusted incidence rate of about 45 per 100,000. When we compare that with less urbanized areas in the UK, in our example is Cambridge, then the incidence is much lower, replicating the effect of population density. But interestingly and secondly from that, what we also find is that the incidence rates in southern European countries, irrespective of population density, tend to be more comparable to the rates for more rural areas in northern Europe than they are for the rates in northern European cities. And the intriguing thing that I think this kind of raises and suggests is that this kind of urban effect that we're talking about, is this necessarily a universal effect, or is it an effect that might be restricted to northern European centres? And related to that, there is a study in Sao Paulo a few years ago now, which found very low rates, relatively very low rates of psychotic disorder. And often methodological issues are thought to be the explanation for that. But it could be that actually what we're seeing is true rates, and that they do vary, and that the impact of different types of environments, or that rather that population density, is not simply related to incidence of psychotic disorder in the way that we've assumed from the studies that we've done so far. So the key point from this is that when you extend the gaze beyond the usual sites and the usual areas, you begin to see quite interesting patterns. And it's by exploring those that they might tell us something about the origins or the onset of psychotic disorder. So I want to move on now to talk a little bit about the data in relation to childhood. And I want to present data, firstly, overall, looking at reported exposure, comparing cases and controls, reported exposure to different types of childhood abuse and trauma. And here, any abuse relates to psychological, physical, and sexual abuse. And when you compare cases and controls, when you combine the entire sample, what we found is that there's about a 40%, 1.4 times greater increase likelihood of reporting these experiences amongst cases compared with controls, which is a bit more modest than is usually reported in the literature. The thing that I think is of interest here is to ask the question, are these associations common across different contexts and different environments? And again, here I'm showing this as kind of indicative data. So when we split it down by country, what you see is that there is some evidence, some variation in the effect, although modestly, so that the odds ratios range between about 1.5 to about 2.5. What's also of interest with this is that the prevalence of these types of experiences in the general populations, if we can trust that the control samples stand for the general population, the prevalence of these risk factors in different populations varies. And what that means is that the importance, the relevance, and the impact of these as risk factors for disorder in different populations will vary. And one way of attempting to capture that is to calculate what's called the population attributable fraction, which tells you, making all kinds of assumptions about causation, it tells you if these experiences are causal, how much of the disorder would be eradicated if you could get rid of the risk factor. And what you see from this in the far column is that somewhere between 10 to 20% would be eradicated. The point here is really to emphasize that the impact of these experiences might vary across different contexts and in different populations. How am I doing for time? Okay, great. So what I wanted to do next then was to show you where we might next go with the analyses, because one of the real values of this data set is because the numbers are so big, and particularly where we find not very many variations in the magnitude of the effect, we can combine the data and begin to look in more detail at these types of experiences. And I just want to show some illustrative analysis of where this might go, but just using data from the UK and specifically from London. So, I don't know if this is stuck again. What I'm going to next show is some data from London, looking at abuse, but specified by type of abuse. They're going to look at age of exposure and look at severity of exposure, asking the questions, do these matter? So firstly, in terms of type, what we're able to do with the data is look at different types of abuse and different types of adversity. And what you've got shown here are household discord. This is home environments where parents argue a lot, bullying, psychological abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. In line with what I've shown already, twofold or more increased likelihood of reporting these experiences amongst cases compared with controls. So no evidence, no strong evidence from this that type of experience matters, although some suggesting that there's a stronger effect for forms of abuse rather than the other types of adversity. If then you look at this by age, and here we've got it split into essentially childhood and adolescence, 0 to 11 and 12 to 16. In showing this for the London data, there is an issue still with the sample size is relatively small. Once we combine this and look at it across the samples, then these might show clearer effects. But there's the intriguing possibility from this that experiences of bullying might matter more in adolescence, and sexual abuse may have a stronger effect during adolescence. And you might think that there are good reasons why this would be, that bullying, for example, at a time when people are developing, establishing friendships where they become much more self-aware and much more conscious of relationships with others, bullying at that time might have a more profound and stronger effect on the later development, or later emotional development. We then broke the data down to look at it in terms of severity. So often when you see in this literature, what you'll see is data presented just simply per risk factor, present or absent, without any real consideration of severity. What we were able to do is to categorize the experience in terms of no exposure, moderate exposure, or marked exposure. And the critical thing to say about marked exposure is that marked is very extreme and also usually involves violence. So we were, for example, we separated out domestic violence, and that's the violence at the far end for household discord. Bullying at a marked level involves physical violence. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, intrinsically violent. And when we split it down in this way, what we find is that the strongest effects are for the most extreme forms of abuse and the most extreme adversities. So, and what I want to point out in this is two things in particular. Firstly, for household discord. So what seems, and this is one study, one set of data, will replicate it or seek to replicate it across the different sites. But what it seems to suggest is that what matters is not so much whether parents argue, but whether or not there's violence in the relationship and violence in the household. Starting here to hint at and to suggest that there may be some specificity in relation to psychotic disorder for violence and more extreme traumatic experiences. Am I running out of time? Okay, so final thing. The next step is also to begin to look at whether or not it's possible to see whether there are combined effects. We'll do this for genetics, but here is a slide just showing some evidence that if you look at early and later exposure to stress or adversity and life events, it's the combination of the two together which particularly increases risk rather than one alone, which suggests it's actually something again to do with exposure to multiple experiences at the more extreme end that matter. And as I mentioned, we'll do this in relation to gene-environment interaction. So this is really to give you a flavor of the EUGI study, the kinds of things that we're going to be able to explore with it. And to finish off, note, a study like this is only done by huge teams of researchers. Here I just mentioned some of the lead researchers, but the real work is done by the army of research workers out in the sites collecting all of this data. Thank you.
I was struck by what you called that in the North or European cities there is more psychosis. Could it have anything to do with alienation? So because maybe people have more a community together in the Southern Europe?
I think this is what we're going to potentially be able to look at with the data. But I guess what I would say is a slight note of caution and caveat. Always with this kind of finding, the first question is, are there methodological explanations? So we need to exclude the possibility that case finding, for example, may have been better in areas where research is very well established. And once we are confident that that's not the explanation, then we can move on to more substantive explanations. And we have data relevant to that kind of question that we could look at to see whether or not it does explain it. But I don't know for now.
In following on, I guess, from that question a little, I'm interested that you found that rural populations seem to have less prevalence of early psychosis. In my experience in rural Australia, we have up to a 10-year delay duration of untreated psychosis. So could it be that there is perhaps a methods issue again with data collection? How can you be convinced that you've actually collected all of the real data, or could we be missing the rural and regional data that isn't coming to the fore at the time that we would expect it to?
Well, I agree, actually. I mean, I think it's very difficult to exclude the possibility that some of this is down to not being able to identify and find cases who, because rural areas, they're more sparsely populated, services are further away and harder to get to, and so on. And I guess one reason why that, or one way of addressing that is not to restrict inclusion in the study by duration. So we do include everyone, and that kind of accounts for the possibility that there might be people out there developing psychosis, but who are not detected because you detect the people who develop it early. It's a slight kind of methodological quirk. The other comment on that, and this is for you all to decide, is the magnitude of difference such that it's plausible that there are that many people out in rural Cambridgeshire with a psychotic disorder who are not presenting to services. And while it may account for some of it, I suspect it's unlikely to account for all of it, all of the excess.
Thanks very much, Craig. On to our next speaker is also from the Institute of Psychiatry, Marta De Forti, who is a MRC clinical scientist at the Institute and is going to talk again about the EUGI, looking at another risk factor, cannabis.
Actually, I'm going to start commenting on the last question. I would also say not all the area in the UGI that are called rural are rural, and I'll tell you more what I mean with that. So we're not talking about countryside, we're talking about cities who do have developed mental health services. So it's more about size of the population rather than really rural and urban distinction. But you'll see why I'm quite keen on making this clear later on. So I'm going to really look a little bit at what Craig has already addressed, in a sense that I'm interested in looking how a different distribution of risk factors within this very large European collaboration perhaps at some point will be able to account for some of the differences in incidence. So I will skip, of course, all the methodology. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the risk factors that I'm interested in, which is cannabis use. And I'm going to start to where I live and work as a researcher, which is the UK. And what is important about cannabis is that when we talk about cannabis, I guess as when we talk about tobacco, alcohol, we need to talk about different types of cannabis, different potency of cannabis, because that can have an important impact on the association with psychosis in terms of what people choose to use and how much as well they use. So I'm going to start with what's available in the UK. And we will all agree that an important contribution to what is decided in the UK comes from the Queen. So our Queen has been interested in trying to make her mind up what's actually there when you go to a dealer. You know, you get your bag of cannabis. Is it actually this type of cannabis you get, or it's this type of cannabis? And in fact, there is a third one. This slide is just to illustrate that by manipulating the genetic of cannabis, but also by changing the environment where cannabis is grown, and UK is becoming quite competent in this, you can go from this sort of that we will know as imported herbal, at least in UK, to this one, which is what we know in UK as skunk because of the intense smell. And then you have something in between, which at least in London or in the London black market is pretty much disappearing, which is the old-fashioned hashish that presents with a soap bar. And the Home Office in UK produced an official document in 2008, so unfortunately it's a bit out of date, but at least up to then we knew that when we talked about this type of cannabis, we had a sort of average content of the active ingredient, which is THC, which is what I'm going to refer pretty much for the rest of the talk, which it was around 6%. When we talked about the soap bar hashish, we had 4 to 5% of THC, but very importantly, we also had the same amount of this other cannabinoid, which is called CBD. And the reason why the ratio between these two is very important is because we know that the pharmacological effect of THC can be very much modified by the presence of CBD. And then skunk can go or could go up to 16%. So at least if we talked about the scenario that preceded the collection of data from both the clinical sample of the UGI and the controls, we know that this is probably what they came across if they did use cannabis. And UK has decided that to get ready for Brexit, they needed to be able to make something to support the economy. And now we are self-sufficient in skunk production in UK. And this is a nice, friendly neighborhood where this family is looking next door and they realize the light is always on. And one of the reasons is because this is what's happening next door. This is an indoor plantation of skunk, and these are quite common in northern England. And you can see, you can even get a manual on how to grow your own cannabis, which of course is in English because it's used in UK. But because we're talking about a European study, not just a UK study, we need to know if this is reflected as well, for instance, in one of the other main collaborators of the UGI, which is the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, when we talk about the type of cannabis available for use, we talk about something very, very different. And this is an official document which is actually produced yearly by the Dutch government, which gives you very good detail about the type of cannabis you can find in the coffee shop and the content. And I don't want necessarily to read all of this. It's also in Dutch. I had to actually learn a few Dutch words to make sense myself. But this is to say that these are the sort of mostly available type of cannabis. And this is the highest concentration of THC in 2 of the commonest variety. And you can see here nether hash, imported hash. So these are 2 types of hash you find in the Netherlands. This is very different from the hash in UK. The highest concentration of THC you find in these 2 types of hash goes up to 67% and 27%. So nothing with my benign 4 to 5% that you find in London. They also produce a breakdown in CBD, and you can see that the amount of CBD is overall pretty low, except in this type of hash where it goes around 7, maximum 8, but this is matching at 27% of THC. I have no idea what happens when you combine 27% of THC with 8% of of CBD. I don't know if CBD is still able to modify the effect of THC or not. But this is just to tell you that when you ask about type of cannabis used in the Netherlands, you have a different scenario from the one of the UK. And we know, for instance, that from recent data published by the European Monitoring Center for Drugs of Addiction, that the hashish that comes from Morocco which is the one that is pretty much available in France and in Spain, and a little bit as well in UK, but not as much as the one I described to you, can have a THC which is up to 18%. And we don't know if there is any CBD or how much CBD. So again, we're talking about an hashish which has a very different potency across the EU. So what I tried to do was to have an idea when I look at type of cannabis use across the center of the UGI study. If I did impose a sort of cutoff of 10% of THC, I can't do that with CBD because not all countries have actually produced available documents with an amount of CBD in the type of cannabis available. If we impose this cutoff, we can see that the only type of cannabis across the EU that are below this cutoff of 10% are the UK hashish, the UK imported herbal, Italian hash, Italian imported herbal. This is the only Dutch variety which is weak, which is this gay imported wheat, and then Spain imported herbal and France. This is, again, this is not an advice, it's not a guide to what type of cannabis you should buy depending where you are in the EU, but it's just to say how these can significantly vary. So if you choose cannabis as a risk factor and you decide to ask about type, you need to bear this in mind. And now you can actually find on the web across the EU, but you need to be able to buy it in euros, so UK is out of the picture. You can just buy CBD oil. So let's sort of look at some of the data that we have on cannabis and pattern of cannabis use across the UGI. You've seen this slide from Craig, so you know these are the sites where the data for the case control analysis have been collected. So this is actually my sample size. As Craig said, there has been a huge amount of work into the cleaning of the data, thanks to all the different sites putting effort. And for the cannabis case control analysis, we have actually a very nice sample size. It's slightly bigger than yours, Craig, so we have a bit more control than the one you actually mentioned. And you know, we definitely are above the initial target of reaching at least 1,000 first episode psychosis cases. And this is to tell you how there are some variation in ethnicity, and there are some variation in level of education. We have many more social demographic, but it would have been illegible if I put more. And this is just to give you a rough idea on the overall sample, what's happening when you look at differences in cannabis use. So altogether, when we look at all the first episode, 61% have reported using cannabis at some point in their life, or overall their age of first use is around 16, and that's not much. I mean, it's a bit different from the one of controls. This is driven by specific countries, but this is not the area we'll look at today. Current use, it's higher in the first episode sample. And then here we get a little bit into the pattern of use. Here we have sort of the frequency. I haven't shown you the data on type because they're very complicated, and I'm trying to make sense how to divide type. If just to use the 10% cutoff or do something a bit more complicated. But you can see that when we get into the pattern of use in terms of frequency, we have that 27% of the first episode have been across Europe daily users, compared to 6% of the control. And as you heard from Craig, these are controlled, they're overall are supposed to represent the population where they are derived from. So I try to look at odds ratio, as Craig has done for the childhood adversity, and I start looking at what happens at pattern of use of cannabis in terms of frequency, and what's the effect on odds ratio across the different countries. Is there sort of a consistency? But are there some countries where, you know, everyday lifetime cannabis use has a greater role? And you can see that these are actually, I was very happy because this sort of replicates previous data just from London. Well, Holland is doing very well in terms of odds ratio, not in terms of psychosis, and there is lots of everyday use. But you can see that consistently across all the sites, one are the never users, of course, you have quite high odds ratio, which I've been able to adjust for age, gender, ethnicity, and other drugs. I will take this high odds ratio with habitual salt. Of course, there are lots of many other risk factors I can adjust for, including childhood abuse, so this might be going down, but you know, I would be surprised if they go down to 1 or 0. what happens to potency? So here I do a preliminary analysis and use the famous cutoff of below and above 10%, with the one above 10% of THC being the sort of moderate to high potency and below the low potency. So first of all, you will remember that, I mean, in Italy, so Palermo is actually where I come from, so it has to be separated from the rest of Italy. And then Italy, the rest of Italy is Bologna and Verona, it's not the rest of Italy. Here, there are not really those variety that would go above the 10% of THC, so you don't expect any effect. And actually, what is interesting in Palermo, there are only 2 people that report having used high potency, and that's because they went on holiday to Amsterdam. So our first episode can afford holiday, so they actually remain linked to low potency hash. But as you can see, in the other countries where there is a sort of availability of slightly higher potency, we do have an effect of type. But I just want to see if, going back to the issue of the variation and incidence that Craig has presented, and some of the comments, what's happening to Northern Europe, what makes Northern Europe different from Southern Europe? It could be the way, you know, the experience in research and the better way of ascertaining psychosis. It could be, as Robin was saying, the lack of the pulp. It could be sunshine, but it might even be that there is a sort of something to do with cannabis or other drugs of abuse that makes some of these countries substantially different. So here there is my graph of some of the incidence rates that's slightly different from the way Craig has presented. I've got actually all the different sites, and you can see that Amsterdam and London have the highest incidence rate. Again, Palermo's got the lowest, so I haven't improved my risk profile to develop psychosis by moving to London, but I'm still okay so far. And what happens if we look at the rates of cannabis use in the controls of these different parts of Europe as a marker of what's happening in the general population in terms of this drug consumption? And you can see that, you know, it is a common drug. We know it's the most widely used illicit drugs in the world, so why should we be surprised? But again, London and the Netherlands, which is Amsterdam, and Leiden are the one with the highest prevalence of cannabis use in the controls. So this is something very preliminary. So this is just a very simple plot of lifetime prevalence of cannabis use across the EU GI sites by the incidence rates calculated as Craig presented. And there is a very nice sort of linear relationship. How this is significant, and of course this can't be just explained by cannabis, but one of the next steps for the work that Craig was suggesting was to see how much of this relationship is can really be explained by variation of cannabis use across the UK, and how these 2 sites with the highest rates, how much cannabis is contributing beyond migration, which we know is much higher, for instance, than it would be in Palermo or even in the other 2 Italian sites. And to conclude, I'm going to use the same measure that Craig presented, which is the population attributable fraction, to say, okay, we have seen that there are increases in the odds ratio of being somebody who has developed a psychotic disorder rather than remaining a control for people that use cannabis daily and they choose high potency. But if we look across Europe, can we see what's the impact at the level actually of these different population measured with the population by the population attributable fraction? And so I'm going to look at the population attributable fraction for daily cannabis use and for the use of high potency with this gross split below and above 10% of THC. And so these are our sites, and this is just a snapshot to say what might be the contribution of daily use. So how many cases of psychosis can be attributed to daily cannabis use across these sites? And what I'm quite pleased is that in London, at least, we replicate some data that we had already published, where a quarter of cases of psychosis can be attributed to daily cannabis use. And you can see that even in Palermo, where there is no high potency, if you still use a lot of cannabis, even if perhaps it's the one of no high potency, you might still have an effect or an impact on number of cases of psychosis. And what happens to high potency? Of course, when you look at population attributable fraction, you can only look in areas where there is a main effect. So you will see that we will not have a population attributable fraction in Palermo and the rest of Italy, but look at London and Holland. I mean, even I sort of struggle to believe this is possible, but again, these are adjusted odds ratio. We will adjust that even more, but it is sort of, these are quite striking population attributable fraction, and this is higher than the one I had found in previous data. Sorry, this is just to remind you what does have an odds ratio and what doesn't. So what do we need? Well, from my point of view, first of all, we need to change the way we take a cannabis history. I don't know in the countries where you work, but in London it's pretty much by GP, primary care physician or consultant psychiatrist. Have you ever used cannabis, yes or no? I don't think you go very far if you don't ask people actually what's their pattern of use in terms of differentiating their risk profile. And I think we need to work more with addiction colleagues, because if there is really such a proportion of cases of psychosis where cannabis has played an important role, we need to work with people that know about drugs perhaps more than early intervention psychosis consultant do know. And then we need to understand, well, I quite passionate understanding the underlying biology, so why this is the case if cannabis has such an important role in psychosis. Thank you very much. Actually, can I say thank you to all these very important researchers and to all the patients actually that have endured in a very long assessment to provide this data. Shout, and I repeat it.
Do you have any comments on those countries?
I'm not an incident expert, but as Craig was saying, one of the problems with psychosis is that we think we know a lot about causes, but we haven't done actually much in terms of basic epidemiology. So they're not actually studies, worldwide studies where you have good incidence and prevalence data from Singapore, Hong Kong. Once I went to Hong Kong when the prevalence of cannabis use is 0.08. So I would not expect, if there is psychosis, we know there is any contribution. But if you ask me what's the incidence rates in Hong Kong, I have no idea, and I'm not sure if, Craig, there is any published data we can quote on that. For instance, Craig and Robin are doing a study in some developing countries. So I do know what cannabis does to the Afro-Caribbean, or if you like, the African in my sample in terms of the odds ratio. I have no idea what cannabis does in countries like Nigeria, where I hear from Nigerian colleagues that is becoming extremely prevalent as a drug of abuse. So the problem is that compared to diabetes or myocardial infarct, we don't have good worldwide data. We have snapshot, and as Craig was saying, this is one of the largest studies. In fact, it's the largest after the WHO.
Yes, in terms of the other drugs used, what are the proportion? Because I'm from Montreal, Canada, and in our population, it's about 20-25% who also use other drugs that might have an interaction or an effect.
Well, as I said, so we do have, together with a very detailed questionnaire for cannabis, we have a detailed questionnaire, and for each drug that is reported, we ask the same question of pattern. So we have at present a data set where you know everything, you can know about sedative, hallucinogenic, stimulant. So here I have control for tobacco and stimulants. I haven't control for sedative or specific hallucinogenic, or we don't actually have very good data for new drugs like legal highs or synthetic cannabinoids, because they were not actually of interest at the time when we collected the data. But what is quite interesting in this first episode, a list overall that the proportion of regular user of other substances is less than 5%. So the other drugs users are more occasional weekends. You find that occasional weekend user of these other substances cluster more in the controls. But I would like to say, do wait for when the data on other drugs have been all clean and analyzed together. In this analysis, I'm controlling for them, so I can't say that all of this is accounted, but I would be surprised if, for instance, in countries like Italy, where cocaine is widely available and in some way more prevalent than cannabis, there is not perhaps more a cocaine effect than cannabis. In Spain, I know Celso, are you here? That, for instance, stimulants are a very big problem, much more in UK. In other countries, methamphetamine are going up. So it would be interesting once we have the good data for each country to see in each of these sites which is the drug that plays the bigger role. Thank you very much.
So last speaker is me. And oh, excuse me, did they come? No. I guess they're tired. They haven't made it. Next slide. No, so shall I do it? Oh no, they won't go. There we go. So I'm going to talk about why do some first episode patients become treatment resistant, and rely particularly on work of Arsimi Demjaha on the right and Alicia Ajnakina on the left. And of course, you all know that the basis for our drug treatment, it's not the only treatment, but the basis for our drug treatment is that there is an excess of dopamine synthesis in people with psychosis. There's too much dopamine being released, and excuse me. And as a consequence of that, the excess dopamine hits the D2 receptor and is the final common pathway to psychosis, we think, in many cases. We spend our time blocking the receptor with antipsychotics, and that diminishes the psychosis. But it doesn't always work. So why do some patients not respond to dopamine blockers? This is work from Arsimi Demjaha, who was a PhD student of myself and Oliver House. And what Arsimi did was to take people with treatment-resistant schizophrenia and do the standard package of a fluorodopa scan to see whether the treatment-resistant people showed the usual excess of of dopamine synthesis that you get in most psychotic people. And so here are healthy volunteers, a PET study, so quite small numbers. Here are people who respond to antipsychotics. So this is the usual finding: people who are psychotic have high striatal dopamine, and of course the reason that they respond to antipsychotics is that we block. We can't do anything about the synthesis of dopamine, but we block its effect with the antipsychotics sitting on the D2 receptor. But here are the people with treatment-resistant illness. It's not that they have too much dopamine to be controlled. They don't differ at all from the healthy volunteers. So the reason that they don't respond to dopamine blockers is that they don't seem to show an abnormality of dopamine with the usual excess dopamine. So that is perhaps the basis for some, at least, of treatment-resistant patients. So how common is treatment resistance? This is the AESOP study that Craig mentioned before, not only mentioned, but also led the 10-year follow-up of this. So there were everybody who was psychotic from 15 to 65 who presented to psychiatric services in the late 90s in 3 English cities. And then by a heroic effort of Margaret Heslin and others, we managed to get a very high proportion of them followed up at 10 years. And of course, although we got good data on over 400 people followed up, we didn't, and how they were at 10 years, we didn't have good information on the drugs that they took over the whole of the follow-up period. So we only got a drug history in a subpopulation, but we had defined 200 patients as being treatment responders. That means that they had a psychotic episode, then they had a period of at least 6 months in which they had no symptoms or disturbed behavior of the type required to define a psychotic episode. So psychotic episode, then later a period of 6 months where they seemed to respond to antipsychotics and the psychotic symptoms disappeared. Then there were 74 individuals who we determined that were treatment resistant. And this is according to the modified Kane criteria. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. You have to have ample doses of 2 antipsychotics for at least 4 weeks. And then, as I say, there were a number of patients, something like 180 patients, on whom we didn't have enough information that we were sure they were taking their antipsychotics to say that they were or were not treatment resistant. So what were the differences between those who responded and those who were treatment resistant? And here you can see the treatment resistant patients. Here you can see the treatment responders. And you can see that the age of onset was significantly earlier in the treatment resistant. Of course, there's lots of data we just heard in another session that early onset is associated with a poor outcome. And the male predominance was significantly greater in the treatment resistant. 71% of the treatment resistant were male as opposed to 52% of the responders. These were all psychotics, but the treatment resistant people were nearly all schizophrenic. A couple of manic and a couple of depressed patients. Whereas there were more people with affective psychosis in the treatment responders. Then, as you would expect, duration of untreated psychosis was very much longer in the treatment-resistant patients than in the treatment responders. Of course, there's the big argument is, does a long DUP cause poor outcome, or is it, at least I would believe, at least in part, that prolonged DUP is a reflection of an insidious bad outcome type of illness. So you can see that the treatment-resistant patients were significantly younger at onset. They were mostly male, almost all have schizophrenia, and they have a longer DUP. So, of course, we've learned that you should never believe one study unless it's replicated. So we decided to try and replicate the study, and this is a study called the GAP study, the Genetics and Psychosis study, which was led by Marta De Forti. And so this is really pretty similar to the AESOP study, except it occurred about a decade later and was confined to South London. So we had about 400 patients, but again, we didn't manage to be absolutely clear data on the drug use and adherence on all of them. So we got that on about 282 patients followed up for over a 5-year period. And now this time 80 met the criteria for treatment resistance. So again, it's a minority of the population. And I should have stressed that the outcome in AESOP and the outcome in GAP was in many ways was very good, but there was this proportion of cases who had a bad outcome. And this is the slide you've already seen, but I'm going to show down the right-hand side the findings from the GAP study, whether they confirmed or didn't confirm the AESOP data. So this is all the AESOP data. Here are the GAP, where the GAP cases of treatment-resistant earlier onset, and they were the GAP cases with treatment-resistant predominantly male, and they were, yes. Were the GAP cases predominantly people with schizophrenia, yes. And where the GAP cases with treatment resistance, did they have a longer DUP? And they did. So both of these studies are showing the same thing. Perhaps we know that these factors influence outcome. They haven't been specifically linked to treatment resistance in the way that we are particularly looking at them. So the next question is, when do people become treatment resistant? Do they start off and they all respond to antipsychotics, but then after 3 or 4 episodes, do they stop responding to antipsychotics? Well, interestingly, 82% of patients with treatment resistance had never responded to antipsychotics. So we defined a group of early treatment resistance. These are people who met the criteria for treatment resistance at 10 years, but they had never experienced a symptomatic remission from the time of their first presentation that lasted for 6 months. So they had always had a poor response to medication. So that was the vast majority of the people who were treatment resistant were so from the beginning. But there was a small group of people who had responded to antipsychotics and had attained a symptomatic recovery, but later on they failed to respond to the ongoing use of a non-clozapine antipsychotics. Obviously, some of them would go on and respond to clozapine. But so there was a small group, 18% of people who initially seemed to respond, and then later they didn't respond. So what were the predictors of early treatment response? Well, because this was the vast bulk of the group, they were pretty much the same as the predictors of overall treatment, treatment-resistant patients. So again, the early treatment-resistant patients had an earlier onset. They were more male, and this time we were able to look at different dimensions, positive, negative, affective, and it was a negative dimension that predicted the early treatment resistance. So the question then is, what causes early treatment resistance? And here, I guess, I'm getting into speculation. So there is the suggestion from the Demjaha study in 2011 that the treatment-resistant people had nothing wrong with their dopamine, striatal dopamine levels, but in the same patients they had an excess of glutamate in the anterior cingulate. So one suggestion has been that there is a non-dopaminergic, glutamatergic type of psychosis. And so we're suggesting that this early treatment resistance type may be the non-dopaminergic type, and perhaps there is neurodevelopmentally induced disorder of the glutamate system. So this is Arsimi Demjaha's model, that you have a predominantly glutamatergic, non-dopaminergic disorder of treatment-resistant schizophrenia, contributed to by family history and perhaps copy number variants, obstetric events showing poor premorbid function, more negative symptoms, and an early age of onset. So this is a jump, obviously, but one might speculate that this is one possibility to explain this early onset treatment-resistant group, which doesn't respond to dopamine blockers. But what about the later treatment resistance, acquired treatment resistance? So in the AESOP study, 18% of people initially responded and then went on not to respond later. In the GAP study, the proportion of early treatment resistant was a bit lower at 67% rather than 82%, and the proportion of late treatment resistant was a bit higher at 33% rather than 18%, and there's technical reasons about the sample as to why that might be the case. But when you compare the early treatment resistant patients to the general sample, you got a number of differences. When you compared the late treatment resistant sample to the treatment responders, there really wasn't much difference. So they seem more like the treatment responders. So why did they become treatment resistant? Well, we know that psychosis often results from excessive release of dopamine, and we block this with dopamine blockers, but we think blocking the D2 receptor is an innocent strategy which is not going to cause changes. But all the evidence from animals is that if you block the D2 receptor over a prolonged period, you get upregulation of the D2 receptor. The D2 receptors become more dense, they become super sensitive, and in animals at least, you find that giving rats, for example, olanzapine or haloperidol over a prolonged period, they gradually lose their effect. And so the suggestion is that the same may happen in people with psychosis in a minority of subjects, that the longer we block the D2 receptors, the more receptors grow, and therefore ultimately the antipsychotic is not able, the D2 blocker is not able to block all the receptors. So the suggestion is we start off with a disorder of presynaptic dopamine, but we cause up regulation and supersensitivity of the D2 receptors with resultant treatment resistance. So again, this is a speculation, but it might be one way of explaining this second, less frequent type of treatment resistance. So what are the implications of this? So if early treatment resistance is a glutamatergic disorder, then we really can't do much about it by pharmacological means. The drug companies have been very keen on developing glutamatergic drugs, but they have all failed. And so we have no pharmacological approach to these people that is likely to be useful. In fact, of course, because they're treatment resistant, what happens is they get piles and piles and piles more antipsychotic, which is probably useless. So maybe we should think of different psychosocial strategies to try and help these patients. Now, if late treatment resistance is secondary to the development of antipsychotic-induced dopamine supersensitivity, then we ought to be able to prevent it, because not all antipsychotics block the D2 receptor and cause supersensitivity. Partial agonists don't do that. So in theory, at least, if we used partial agonists from the beginning of the illness, we should be able to prevent the development of this dopamine supersensitivity and the late onset treatment resistance. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much. So now questions actually for anybody. A gentleman in green. Yeah, so you can.
Yeah, thank you for all these wonderful talks. I have a question concerning the last presentation. There has been a study which suggested that if you start clozapine later, the chance of patients reacting to clozapine gets smaller. But this was a retrospective study, so the quality was not so good. I was wondering if you have looked into these data, which is a follow-up study, whether if patients were these early treatment-resistant patients were put on clozapine quickly, if they reacted better.
We've begun to look at that, but we haven't done it. There is, of course, the big Chinese study of Jeff Lieberman and Dr. Phillips, I think, and they gave clozapine to first onset patients, and they didn't do better than patients as a whole. So I'm not quite answering your question, but the point of saying that is, why is it that clozapine only works in better in treatment-resistant patients and not in ordinary patients? Maybe that's because we have done something to the patients to change them, which could be by giving them antipsychotics. Clozapine is perhaps the best treatment for tardive dyskinesia. And of course, that's a dopamine sensitivity condition. So maybe clozapine normalizes, with the lower dopamine, normalizes the dopamine supersensitivity, maybe.
Along the same point, I looked at this literature quite closely 5 or so years ago and found a Herb Meltzer paper on the original clozapine studies from the late 80s where he subdivided early treatment resistance and late treatment resistance and found that clozapine, if I recall, worked much better on the late treatment resistance. Those who had previously responded and lost it responded better to clozapine than those who had never responded to anything. So, but that was only in one paper.
Yes.
And I
yes.
searched all the rest of his and I couldn't find it.
It's
I've
interesting
seen him do talks,
how little it's been studied.
And I've seen him do talks where he was requested to address that point and he didn't.
Okay. Any other questions? Any other questions apart from Marta, who's yep.
Well, I couldn't help myself from noticing, especially when you presented the gap data, who of course I know quite well. So when you think about the late non-responders, so the one that are very similar to the responders but perhaps acquired a supersensitivity, well, there are suggestions in terms of neuroimaging in humans, cannabis users, but also from animal model, that one of the way cannabis is, can induce psychosis is by determining a postsynaptic supersensitivity. There are some people that have indicated that also cannabis use is associated with an earlier onset. So there are some similarity with some of your treatment resistance. We also know that cannabis is associated with poor outcome. So have you controlled for cannabis?
I knew she was going to ask this question, and I knew I didn't have the answer. So the point is a very good point, that most people with acute psychosis release too much dopamine. But cannabis users, like all other drug addicts, have a suppression of their dopamine. But they still go psychotic if you push it up a little bit with stress. So the suggestion is that they have D2 supersensitivity induced by cannabis. So it would be a good explanation for another good explanation for people developing not responding with, for it'd be a good explanation for people treatment resistant having low dopamine and possibly supersensitivity. So I guess we have to think you can have more types of dopamine dysregulation. It can be mostly presynaptic, but maybe also postsynaptic as well. And I think it's time you deserve a prize for sticking it out, and we should now go to the reception, I think. Thank you.